I think in the world that we're going forward, food's going to be a lot more valuable than oil's going to be.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming here at the Appel Salon at the Toronto Public Library. And now, please help me welcome Jeff Rubin and Rudyard Griffiths.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. First off, this is a terrific institution, and to have a salon like this, the opportunity to have an informal conversation with somebody such as Jeff, who has great insights, expertise, and the courage of his own convictions is a privilege indeed. We are going to talk for a little bit. We're going to kick around some of the core ideas that he sets out in his new book. And then I want to come to you, the audience, because this is a salon. We're here for public debate and public discussion, and that means your participation. So take out your notepads, your pens, your smartphones, jot down a question or two. We'll have open microphones here, and probably at the 30 or 35-minute mark, we'll go to you and go to the floor. But let's start with Jeff Rubin first. And Jeff, congratulations on the book. It's, like all your books, eminently readable. You know, the economics gets knocked as the dismal science. I can say you're not a dismal writer. So let's start with the title of the book and the word bubble, because this is a kind of, it's critical to how you set out the ideas in the book, and it's an important economic phenomenon to understand. So unpack that for us first.
Well, you may all remember when you were kids going in the backyard with the wand and putting some dish detergent in and creating these little effervescent spheres that seem to defy gravity and just float aimlessly in the air, and then all of a sudden, they're gone without a trace. And almost as instantaneously as they occur, they disappear. Well, bubbles aren't just in your backyard. Bubbles are in the economy. And they're probably a more frequent and common state than most people would recognize. In the last 15 years, I mean, certainly during my tenure as the chief economist on Bay Street, I've seen about 3. At the turn of the millennium, there was the dot-com bubble. And one day, one stock, Nortel Networks, was 30% of the whole TSX composite. And a year later, poof, it's gone. Billions of dollars of market cap disappeared. And then there was the subprime mortgage bubble. I knew that bubble better. The bank that I used to work for wrote down some $7 billion in these financial market securities called collateralized debt obligations, which were funded by mortgage payments of unemployed homeowners. And the reason that banks had so many of them is rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's would tell financial institutions that the risk of these instruments defaulting were about the same as the government of Canada or the US Treasury. And then poof, there goes $7 billion of CDOs. And believe me, there were other financial institutions who had to write off a lot more than Canadian banks and my former bank. And now there's the carbon bubble. And the carbon bubble is basically the assumption that we can consume and emit as much carbon as we need. And the one common characteristic of all these 3 bubbles is that they're based on a fundamental premise that turns out to be wrong. You know, in the case of IT, that we would have exponential growth in sales and that valuations could be at an infinite multiple of earnings. In the case of the subprime mortgage bubble, that people who didn't have jobs could get funded to buy homes and somehow they were going to make their mortgage payments. And again, I say in the carbon bubble. And I think in this particular case, what we have to confront with is, a pretty solid consensus from the scientific community that not only is there a limit to how much we can emit, but we're coming up against that limit very rapidly. That this is not an issue that our great-grandchildren are going to have to confront. This is an issue that we have to confront today, and if you look at the valuations of coal stocks and oil sand stocks, I think you'll gain some appreciation that we already are confronting this bubble.
Jeff, explain to us, though, how a market, which is driven by profit, is driven often by very short-term considerations, a month, a quarter, a year out, is influenced by this scientific consensus about a multi-decade, centuries-long impact of climate change. How does that feed back on the market? Because the two initially, in my mind, seem somewhat disconnected.
Okay. Let's just understand what the carbon threshold, 450 parts per million in the atmosphere, implies about our future use of fossil fuels. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, who are probably the authoritative body on energy usage, has calculated. So if we are going to hold carbon at 450 parts per million, we're about 400 right now, and avert the worst consequences of global climate change, what does that imply about our use of carbon fuels, not in the next 30 years, in the next decade? And it implies a very different demand outlook than the one embedded in the business plans of coal companies and oil companies. For example, coal consumption is going to have to fall by over 30%. And oil consumption is probably going to have to peak in the next 4 to 5 years and then fall by 15 to 20%. Well, if that's in fact the demand outlook, that has a very different implication on prices. And that, of course, has a very different implication on who can operate and who cannot operate. And in Canada's particular case, yeah, we may have the third largest oil reserves in the world, but they're the highest cost oil. And that means they're the most vulnerable to falling prices. And what does a demand forecast of 15% decline imply about oil prices in the future? Probably the same what the 30% decline in coal consumption applies to coal prices.
Jeff, speak to us, though, about the skeptics in the audience here who've heard governments come out, our own government, and announce targets for 2020, targets for 2030, targets for 2050. None of these governments, not just Canada, but the big emitters, China, the United States, they don't meet those targets. So where do you see this demand falling off in the face of what seems to be the evidence of the last quarter century of struggling to address climate change, where we haven't substantially reduced our use of carbon resources, we haven't substantially reduced global emissions?
Well, I guess I would answer it this way. 3 years ago, shareholders in Peabody Energy, which is the largest publicly traded coal firm in the US, S&P 500, went to sleep every night confident that the chances of a global treaty on carbon emissions was virtually nil. And probably the odds of that haven't changed. Recently, they woke up to a nightmare because, for very different reasons, the two biggest coal-consuming economies of the world, China and the United States, have suddenly clamped down on coal consumption. And instead of China, which single-handedly combusts 4 billion tons of coal, 50% of the world total, every year China's coal consumption was growing at 10-15%. Last year, coal consumption fell in China and the United States. And not because they were trying to live up to any international obligation on carbon, but because you couldn't see outside. And not in Inner Mongolia or in Tibet. They had to close the Pudong airport in Shanghai because nobody could see the runway. So it was the apocalypse. Now, you may be cynical about, China's past environmental record. Okay, there's reasons for that. But let me point out something. When the Chinese authorities elevate something to be a national priority, like family planning, for example, they have the means to deliver on that in a capacity not possible in our economies. Now, what about the United States? I mean, all of a sudden, the bar has been raised that effectively precludes new coal-fired plants from being built that would meet EPA requirements. But of course, what has allowed President Obama to do that is the shale gas revolution, which has all of a sudden made coal a high-cost fuel. But here's how the goalposts have moved dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, for very different reasons. But I would argue that the actions taken by the United States and China on coal have been as devastating to Peabody Energy, to Arch Coal, to Alpha Resources, as any global agreement would be on carbon emissions. Is it that big a jump to go from coal to bitumen? Would be the question that I think we have to ask ourselves.
So talk a little bit about that. You write in the book about a strategy which Canada has been engaged in over the last decade to take this resource, this bitumen, process it, and turn this into profits for corporations, profits for investors, royalties for provincial and federal governments. To a lot of us, that doesn't sound so bad. Yes, there are ethical dimensions, but there is a substantial national economic impact and benefit from the exploitation of this resource. You think it's a bankrupt strategy? Why?
No, I mean, I think it's great if it's sustainable. What I would argue is this sustainable? I mean, is the highest cost source of oil going to be sustainable in a carbon-constrained world that's going to force low oil prices? And I would argue the conversation has changed. The conversation was about us becoming an energy superpower, that we would ramp up production from the oil sands from 2 million barrels to 5 million barrels. And hence, that's why we need pipelines all over the continent. That's why unit trains of DOT 111 tanker cars pass through Toronto all the time to carry this new product out. But guess what? We're not going to have any expansion of the oil sands production. Every week when you hear Jocelyn Mine canceled, Pierre River Mine canceled, these are the projects that were going to produce the extra 3 million barrels a day that those pipelines were going to take. If those projects don't go ahead, and they're not going ahead because they don't make any economic sense, we don't need any pipelines. Pipelines have lost their economic context. Sure, it would be great to produce 5 million barrels a day in a world of triple-digit oil prices, but I think that the bigger question is going to be how much of the 2 million barrels a day is sustainable, and if it isn't, and good portions of it aren't, how exactly do you shut an oil sands mine down? Because it's not the same as fracking a shale formation where the depletion rate's 50%. You just have to stop fracking, and all of a sudden your supply goes down. Has anybody figured out the cost of decommissioning an oil sands mine? Usually when firms walk away from mines like the giant mine in Yellowknife, it's because they're bankrupt at that point and they don't have money to decommission oil sands. So I think this resource is going to be very, very problematic going ahead in the future. And, you know, again, I think the question is going to shift from expansion to sustainability.
Talk to us a bit, because you write about it in the book, you know, the real revolution of supply in the United States.
Absolutely.
And the degree to which maybe many Canadians don't fully appreciate the efficiencies and innovation that's occurred in the U.S. that's allowed America now to become, challenge really Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil producer. How is that really a systemic threat to the future of the oil sands as, again, the basis for Canada to be an energy superpower?
You see, the context of us going from 2 million barrels a day to 5 million barrels a day was all about the U.S. market. Okay, that was where we were going to sell that oil to. And circa 2006, 2007, that was a thirsty market. The U.S. used to produce 10, 11 million barrels a day in the early 70s. By 2005, they were down to producing barely over 5 million barrels a day. So they needed our oil, and instead of relying on big bad Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or the Middle East, our friendly neighbor to the north. And moreover, our friendly neighbor to the north allowed private investment in their oil sands, in our oil patch, which we may take for granted, but in fact that's a very unique proposition in most hydrocarbon resources in the world. All of a sudden, however, there were new sources of supply. See, those rising oil prices that all of a sudden took bitumen out of oil sands, took light oil out of shale formations through this process called hydraulic fracking, or what's also fracturing or fracking. And all of a sudden, places like the Bakken in North Dakota was producing over 1 million barrels a day. Like all of a sudden, North Dakota was producing almost as much as Texas. And then the Permian Basin in Texas and Eagle Ford were producing 1 million barrels a day. And all of a sudden, the U.S. was producing 10 million barrels a day and didn't need Canada's oil sands. And hence, we're scrambling for new markets and the whole question of pipeline access to, to tidewater to get there. But as it turns out, not only does the U.S. not need our oil, nobody needs our oil. And our oil is the highest cost oil in the world, and to exacerbate that, they get the lowest prices. Because when you think about oil prices and you listen to BNN or CBC and it goes $57.40 West Texas Intermediate, dream on. These guys would love to get West Texas Intermediate. These guys get Western Canadian Select. That's the price for heavy oil from the oil sands. During the first quarter of the year, Western Canadian Select averaged under $40 a barrel. That's why I'm saying, pipelines no longer have an economic context, because at $40 a barrel, we're not going to be doubling oil sand production. The issue is how much of current production is sustainable.
This is gloomy news, but this is actually a positive book, and you have a message here. You think a strategy for Canada to not simply survive, but thrive in a lower carbon world. So why don't you unpack a bit of that for us?
I think the Prime Minister's greatest folly here, and I don't want to villainize Stephen Harper. I'm sure he's well-intentioned. I'm sure that he really thought that the development of a petro-economy was going to be transformative and create wealth for all Canadians. But I think his greatest failing here is not just to back a stranded asset, not just to back something the rest of the world is shorting, but rather his denial of climate change. And, it's perfectly logical why you would want to deny climate change if you thought that the oil sands was going to be the engine of economic growth. Because once you accepted climate change and carbon restrictions, then you're not talking about an expanding market, you're talking about a shrinking market, and that doesn't provide a lot of opportunity for high-cost oil like bitumen for the oil sands. I understand all that. But what we've ignored is the economic opportunities that climate change will bring. And I think that if you look at any of the research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN scientific body, or even the US Space Agency, NASA, they've identified Canada as a climate change hot zone, particularly the Canadian prairies as a climate change hot zone. And what do they mean by that? They mean temperature changes a multiple of the global average. And what that does is it changes flora and fauna. And what it does, it changes the agricultural potential of the land. You raise the thermostat 3 to 4 degrees, and that's what's being predicted on the northern margins of agriculture, Peace River, another 3 degrees by mid-century. The southern areas, the prairies, like about Lethbridge, another 2 degrees. You've just added on another 3 to 4 weeks to the growing season, which is already 2 to 3 weeks longer than it was 50 years ago. What does that mean? That means, the knock against the prairies was never the fertility of the soil, it was the length of the growing season. You start increasing the growing season like 30, 40%, and your yields per acre go through the roof. And not only your yields per acre, but it changes what you can grow. You don't grow much corn on the western prairies, and the reason you don't is it takes a longer grower season than wheat. That's starting to change, and believe me, that has not been lost on DuPont Pioneer on Monsanto. Maybe Prime Minister Harper hasn't figured it out, but they have, okay? And in the last couple of years, they've been holding seminars through prairie agricultural communities trying to convince wheat farmers to start growing corn. Okay, why do you want to shift from wheat to corn? Because it's a much bigger cash crop, because all of a sudden your acre is worth a lot more. So I think the positive here is that, yes, climate change is going to devalue our hydrocarbon resources, be it coal, be it natural gas, be it bitumen. But at the same time, it's going to make other of our resources way more valuable, our land and our water. And realize that when you turn the thermostat up in Peace River, you're growing corn. When you turn the thermostat up 3 degrees in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, you're killing corn. So what we're going to see is a whole migration of agricultural activity from low latitudes to high latitudes. And, I would say that Prime Minister Harper may yet be right. Western Canada may be the engine of economic growth, but it's not going to be bitumen. It's going to be food. And that's going to be a very value-added trade, because it's not, if you look at the commodity sector, it's not just oil that's fallen. Coal's fallen more, iron ore's fallen, zinc, copper, you name it. There's one sector that's been resilient. Guess what that sector is? Sure, there's year-to-year changes in crops, but the one sector that has been resilient is food. Now just consider what climate change impact will have on oil prices, what climate change impact will have on food prices, and going to a breadbasket will be a lot more value added than being a producer of high-cost bitumen.
I'm going to start getting to questions in a moment, but there was another hopeful message in this book, that we can achieve GDP growth, that our economies can become larger while having less carbon intensity in terms of each unit of GDP. And that's often counterintuitive to how
what we've all been told.
Many of us think, which is that, hey, if we're going to green our economy, this is great for the environment, but we're going to pay a cost, a real cost, in terms of future economic growth.
Absolutely. We've all been schooled to believe that there's a trade-off, that, if we want to improve our economy, it's going to come at the expense of economic growth, it's going to come at the expense of jobs, it's going to come at the expense of income. But once you put a carbon constraint in the picture, that totally changes it on its head. Where do carbon emissions come from? Carbon emissions come from economic activity. The only time that we've been successful at managing carbon emissions is during recessions. And most people don't think that's an attractive remedy for carbon management. And we wouldn't just be talking about a recession, we'd be talking about a permanent recession. So sure, we could stop growing. But if we want to grow, and we're running up against this 1,000 gigatons left to emit, we're only going to be able to grow if at the same time we can reduce our carbon intensity. So in arithmetic terms, if GDP is going to grow at 2%, then carbon per unit of GDP has to fall 2% to keep our emissions flat. And that totally changes it. It's grow green or don't grow. Okay, and that's really the choice that we're going to have to make, and the adjustment we're going to have to make. It's no longer a trade-off. All of a sudden, economic growth and environmental sustainability are on the same page. And I think that that's a huge difference in the way that traditionally we've been, schooled to look at this issue.
Let's bring this down to the most practical level, Jeff, in our remaining moments. 20-odd years at the bank, looking at markets. How should individual investors, as citizens, think about the arguments that you're putting forward? What are the strategies that are both ethical, but also, frankly, advantageous for each of us individually to try to take advantage of these big shifts that you're predicting in terms of a carbon economy versus an economy of more renewables, new forms of energy that reduce our total carbon emissions?
Well, I think when you look at it, you'll find that, if you save your portfolio, you'll be doing good things to save the world. In other words, if you divest from carbon stocks, you won't only be helping on the carbon pollution front, you'll be increasing the returns of your portfolio. And that the problem that investors have in Canada, you might go, well, Jeff, I don't own Canadian Natural Resources, I don't own Suncor, it's not my problem. I just own the TSX index. Well, guess what? You own a lot of these stocks. I mean, the energy sector is the second largest GIC or sector in the TSX. It's 22%, okay? So that's the problem, and that's one of the reasons why the TSX has underperformed. For example, the S&P 500, it's got double the oil in it, and not only does it have double the oil in it, but it has the highest cost oil. So, I think, what's really needed, it would be great if there was a way of buying the TSX without the oil sands, because you would in fact get better performance. That's not available right now. Maybe one day it is. What should you buy? I mean, what resources or what assets become more valuable? It becomes farmland. And increasingly you're seeing institutions from Saudi Arabia wealth funds to the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board buying farmland. Typically what they do is they buy the land and then lease it back to the farmer. Not the easiest thing for you to do, unless you want to actually become a farmer, which most people don't want to do. There are some closed-end funds that do the same. They're not ideal. I mean, they're not as liquid and transparent as some, but you know what? My 20 years of experience as a managing director of a major investment bank leads me to believe that Bay Street will come up with vehicles that will allow the public to have more access to farmland as it becomes increasingly clear, not just to pension funds, but to the investing public, that this is the most, the highest value asset around right now. If I could just add a caveat, it's interesting in Saskatchewan that Saskatchewan has now banned pension funds from buying land. And that reflects a schism in the farm community. If you're a young farmer and you want to increase your acreage under cultivation, you don't really want to compete with a $230 billion Canada Pension Plan Investment Board for land. On the other hand, if you're an older farmer, and 70% of the farmers are over 50 years old, you want Saudi wealth funds knocking on your door. So we'll see how that plays out, but if I'm right about the climate changes and how that impact is going to affect the agricultural productivity of the prairies, we're going to be seeing a lot of capital chasing farmland.
Final question, then we'll open it up to the floor. This sounds promising, but it also sounds kind of retro. It sounds like hewers of wood and drawers of water, that we're kind of going back to a 19th century model for the Canadian economy. What do you think about other potential prospects for growth? If we're minus the big kick that we've had over the last decade out of the oil sands, and we're struggling in autos, we're struggling in high tech, is this what we're left with, kind of going back to?
Well, there's a lot of questions in that. I would argue part of our problem in manufacturing and autos is the flip side of oil. That when you become a petrocurrency and when you trade, as high as $1.08, like we did a couple of years ago against the U.S., guess what? You decimate your manufacturing sector, and we've lost about 500,000 jobs. I have a chapter called mean reversion. It's a term in finance where you go from one extreme to the other. You might call the election of the NDP government in Alberta an example of mean reversion. I think before this bubble is burst, we're going to see the Canadian dollar back in the 70-cent range, and I think that will have an impact on the manufacturing sector. But, getting back to, we're not going to be an oil power, yeah, but, breadbasket may sound like drawers of water and hewers of wood, but you know, I think in the world that we're going forward, food's going to be a lot more valuable than oil's going to be. And while Canada, you know, has always been a major agricultural exporter, I think we're like the 8th or 9th, you know, we would have a chance of, you know, being, you know, in the top 3. As far as going back to the past, you know, if you look at the flag of Alberta, there is no pipelines, there's no oil wells, but there is wheat. And the same with Saskatchewan. So maybe it is a big circle.
Yeah. Great. Let's open it up to the floor now. I just want to remind people that we want a question, a focused question from you, so we can hopefully move through as many as possible as we have in our remaining time, approximately 25 minutes. So, sir, I will go to you first.
Hi, Jeff. I enjoyed all your books, so can I start off with a retro question? I'd like you to provide government's advice on transportation policy. Basically, trains are much more efficient than other modes of transport. And just to give a bit of context to what I'm talking about, in Ontario, the province has wanted to privatize Ontario Northland and cancel the passenger service. Most people don't know you can't take a train from Toronto to anywhere in Northern Ontario now. And secondly, Via Rail is always limping along. So how would you advise governments to take advantage of this carbon bubble in terms of transport?
Well, transport is key for oil. I mean, transport pretty well is the only reason we burn oil anymore. We used to burn oil for home heating and power generation. We don't do that anymore. I think the key is get off the road. And the ways of getting off the road are twofold. A, investment in public transit, and B, carbon taxes on fuel. And, you know, our problem is, like when you go and buy a bottle of rum, it doesn't depend on the price of sugar cane. And when you buy a package of cigarettes, it's not solely a function of the price of tobacco. Why should the price of filling up be solely a price of the cost of extracting oil and not of emitting oil? And you know, that's the world that we have to go to. As I said before, I think we need to shift the tax base to carbon. The other part of the equation is investment in public transit, because if people aren't going to take cars, they still have to get around. And you know, I think those are probably the two major levers that we have.
Great. Thank you for your question. Let's hear the next one.
Jeff, in your previous book, you mentioned about triple-digit oil price causing economic problems.
That's right.
Yeah. What about now? Your comment.
Well, you know, I think we've now had a decade of triple-digit oil prices, or pretty close to a decade. And I think the empirical evidence is clear. The world economy does not do well with triple-digit oil prices. We've not only experienced the worst post-war recession, but the resulting recovery has been, you know, one of the most anemic on record, because by 2011, Brent, which was the world oil price, was already back over $100, and average that until 2014. And look around at the performance of the economy, no matter where you look. Everybody's geared down. I mean, that was really the focus of my second book, The End of Growth. Whether we're talking about the BRICS, I mean, China's not growing at 10. It's probably really growing today at 5. You know, I mean, India's not growing at 8. Brazil's not growing at, you know, Russia's not growing at all. So Japan, they're not growing. Europe arguably never got out of the recession. And, you know, when we grow at 2%, we think we're doing great. So, you know, I think it's pretty clear that the world economy doesn't operate well with these triple-digit oil prices. And, you know, perhaps that's not such a mystery. Oil is still the single most important fuel powering the world economy. And that's really the catch-22, or the dichotomy that the oil sands and all high-cost sources of oil face, including some of the fracking as well, that the kind of prices that you need to extract that oil out of the ground and make that and provide a commercially attractive return are the same prices that kill economic growth and kill oil demand. And that's, you know, part of the reason why oil prices have fallen so much, is that, you know, we're not seeing China grow at 10 to 12% anymore, and that's leaving a huge imprint on coal prices and on oil prices, and perhaps in time even on natural gas prices.
Jeff, I know it was when you were putting the book to bed, but talk to us a bit about what we've seen happen with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, in a sense, saying, we see a threat here in terms of this unconventional American supply, not just to the U.S., but globally, and we're going to take it out by moving prices low for long. How does that kind of factor into to your theories?
That's one way of seeing it. And it's the way that it's presented in the business press, that this is a price war motivated by Saudi Arabia to take out high-cost competition like the oil sands and shale production. I see it a different way. Saudi Arabia is the low-cost producer. If there is a glut in the market, who is expected to shut production? The low-cost producer or the high-cost producer? It's not Saudi Arabia that's created the glut of oil. Saudi Arabia and OPEC are pumping out roughly the 30 million barrels a day that they have for the last 3 to 4 years. Where the glut has come from is, guess where? Canada and the United States. The oil in the last 4 years, oil sands is up 1 million and shale's up 4 or 5 million. So it's not that all of a sudden Saudi Arabia went, hey, let's really rev things up and produce another 5 million barrels a day. It's been we who have produced it, but unfortunately, we can't produce the oil at the same price as Saudi Arabia, and hence the adjustment has to fall on us. The biggest problem for us is the shale guys can just count on depletion to create, to cut down production, because a shale well, after 1 year, you're getting about 50% less. It's not so easy with an oil sand mines, and Rudyard, we're still increasing production. Okay, even though there's this huge glut, even though Western Canadian Select was trading at under $40 a barrel, we're still bringing on another 400,000 to 600,000 barrels a day. That's not sustainable, okay? Now, I'm not talking environmentally sustainable. I'm saying that's not financially sustainable.
Great. Let's go to the microphone for another audience question.
How do the people of Canada deal with global warming if our government doesn't believe in it, and we're next door to the United States, who has one major party that believes that global warming is a democratic joke?
Well, it doesn't really matter whether the government believes it or not. What's important is you believe it and you respond to it. Just like Monsanto, they're responding to it. They don't care if Stephen Harper thinks global warming's a joke. They're just understand the commercial opportunities there and are acting on it. And I'm saying there are all kinds of opportunities that global warming is going to provide Canada, including, by the way, the Northwest Passage and all the traffic that it can divert from the Suez and from the Panama Canal. Guess what? Putin's bought into that. Russia has 14 deep water Arctic ports. We have none. Okay. Our closest is Churchill, 2,000 kilometers away. What about hydropower? I mean, if we're an energy superpower, we got a lot better claim of saying that in hydro, where we're number 2 in the world, next to only China, than in oil. I mean, we have untapped hydro. The environmental goalposts may move against shale gas in 3 to 4 years, just like it did against coal, because if you count the fugitive methane emissions from shale gas, it's highly debatable how much better it is on carbon pollution than coal or oil. So I think there's going to be all kinds of economic opportunities. And again, I say, you're not relying on Stephen Harper. First of all, you can vote in another government. And even if you don't vote in another government, I mean, we don't have to have the ideological blinkers that the Harper government has on climate change, because we don't have to have a vested interest in the oil sands. And as I'm saying, I think we have to start thinking, not just about the costs of climate change, but the opportunities. And as I say, I think, farmland is probably the biggest opportunity, but there are other opportunities as well.
Great. Let's go to the microphone for another question.
Yes, thanks for your trenchant analysis of oil, energy, politics, and the economy in general. One quick comment, as was revealed on CNN this afternoon, Osama bin Laden believed in climate change and as a strategic thinker was worried about its impact on his global mission. But my question is, do you think economists, politicians, and the general public are perhaps too focused on growth and the sort of, as the mantra and the metric for judging economic happiness? I noticed the government of Bhutan is pushing the National Happiness Index as a better metric.
Well, I know one guy who's big time into that, and I guess he'll be talking here next week. I toured with him across the country on my second book, The End of Growth. David Suzuki was the only person who thought that had a bullish message. So we had a thing called the Eco Tour, you know, ecology, economics. I know what you're saying. You know, are we really that much more satisfied as a society than we were when our income per capita was 20% less? And, you know, it's not abundantly clear, but you know what? It's not exactly a pressing question now because while we may want growth, we're not having growth, as I pointed out. Like, you know, anywhere you go, the economies are growing at a fraction of what they were growing before the last recession. Maybe they're different rates at different places, but if you benchmark it to what it was before, growth is becoming more difficult. But growth is even going to become more difficult if we only got 1,000 gigatons to emit, and then we go back to, you know, you want to grow, it's grow green or don't grow. And that's a very different world than the world we've been accustomed to.
Thank you.
Let's have another question, please.
I also read your book, The End of Growth, Jeff, and found it very interesting. I'd be interested in knowing what your impression is of the increasing emphasis in the financial community, if I understand it correctly, on divestments. The Climate Action Network and many environmental activists are encouraged by the extent to which this is beginning to take off. And the business pages of the Globe and Mail and all the dailies discuss this from time to time. Also, you talk about green growth if we're going to grow at all. And you did mention hydropower, but what's your impression of some of the other renewable energies like solar or wind? There was an article in the back page of the Globe's business section yesterday about solar really being an underappreciated resource to invest in. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, in countries like Germany and Spain, solar and wind are now like 25–30% of the grid, and that's going to continue. And obviously, that's going to become more and more of an important source of energy in a carbon-constrained world. I think that's, you know, absolutely the case. Up until Fukushima, nuclear, most people would have probably thought nuclear was going to be the big alternative to carbon. Post-Fukushima, outside of China, India, and South Korea, I don't think anybody's building nuclear power plants. Japan still has shuttered all of its nuclear power plants, and that's a country that relied on nuclear power for 30%. On the divestment, and that's probably an area where you might, you know, hear of me being involved in the future, let me just say this. I'll give you an example. Stanford University has an $18 billion endowment fund, and they have recently jettisoned coal stocks. And of course, they made a big deal about what they were doing this because of their sense of social responsibility. What they failed to mention was that the coal stocks that they were jettisoning had already lost 90% of their value, had been downgraded so many times by rating agencies that they were no longer investment grade and hence not eligible to be held in an institution fund. To put this in a Canadian context, my alma mater, of which I make a very modest contribution every year to their endowment fund, the University of Toronto, I graduated from Innis College, has a $1.9 billion fund, the largest in Canada, and guess what's in their fund? Canadian Natural Resources, Suncor, Chevron, Exxon. But guess what? Those stocks have had the same impact on U of T's endowment fund as those coal stocks have had on Stanford. So I have a chapter in there saying, save your portfolio before you save the world. In other words, even if you couldn't care less that we're going to Cooksville, even if you were totally indifferent to climate change, there's a very good reason why you want to divest, because these stocks are a dog and they're going to cost your portfolio money. And that certainly is a base broadening consideration.
Great. Let's take another question.
If Canada is open to private investment, when there's a dust bowl in central U.S. and California has run out of oil, do we not run into whose water and whose farm and whose food is it up here? Do we not run into a security problem?
Well, you know, the U.S. have always coveted our water, and we've had some, I write in my book, some Dr. Strangelove schemes when you think about like the North American Water and Power Alliance scheme that was going to basically flood the entire Rocky Mountain Trench in BC, create a reservoir 16 times the size of Lake Mead, and then pump it all the way into the Colorado Basin. And you know, when you read about what's happening in California, you go, whoa, I bet there's someone in the LA Department of Water and Power thinking up another one. But let me just point out something. You know, in a world of climate change, and believe me, California is a perfect example, you aren't growing almonds in Fresno. You're not growing Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa because you're a desert, okay? And California is the #1 agricultural producing state in the #1 agricultural producing economy, the U.S., and that's just not sustainable. And the only way they've done that is by siphoning off other people's water, in this particular case, the Colorado. What about our water? There's going to be interest in that. But you know what? Instead of bulk water exports, what do you think food is? I mean, it takes 1,500 liters of water to grow a kilogram of wheat. So when you're an agricultural exporter, you are a virtual exporter of water. But it's highly processed water. It's value-added water. It's the difference between exporting petrochemicals and raw bitumen. So yes, we are going to be water exporters. Yes, water is Canada's greatest resource, but it's not through bulk water exports, it's through food that we're going to be exporting water.
Great. Thank you for your question. Let's have another.
First of all, I just wanted to say how encouraging it is to hear a corporate economist talking about carbon taxes and climate change. So
Well, I'm not
applaud you
corporate
for
anymore.
that.
That's why.
Off the payroll.
Yeah, I'm definitely off the payroll. And have been for some time.
So earlier on, you made a little quip about China and how their authoritarian political model might make it easier for them to implement certain regulations, certain policies to deal with climate change. You look around that neighborhood and you see countries like India or Indonesia, which are large, populous democracies and are going to perhaps be equally problematic in terms of resource consumption. So I would ask you, in your opinion, which political system, which model is going to be more effective for dealing with climate change, democracy or authoritarianism, particularly in developing countries?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. You know, when President Obama came to sign that carbon treaty, they shut down half of the steel plants in Beijing the week before, you know, to clean up the air, just like they did for the Beijing Olympics. And, you know, I mean, can you imagine the EPA just going up to a steel plant saying, guess what, you're shutting down, okay? You know, I mean, obviously you can do things that you otherwise couldn't, but, you know, whether we do it through democratic institutions, whether we do it through authoritative institutions, we're going to do it because we have no choice and we have to do it. And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. What I'm saying is, you know, people who invest in carbon stocks should not take much solace from the fact that, you know, the Paris Summit will fail to provide any meaningful global restrictions on emissions, because individual countries are moving on their own. And the aggregation of all of those individual countries is something comparable to what we would have expected from a global agreement on carbon. But you know, the goalposts are moving, and they're moving very rapidly. And they're moving in both authoritarian regimes like China, and they're moving in democratic countries. But let's understand why they're moving in authoritarian regimes. Because, you know, you go outside in Beijing and you think you're in an Afghan sandstorm, you know. So it doesn't matter whether you're authoritarian or democratic, you know, government's going to respond to stuff like that. And I think that that's going to become the norm here. And as that becomes the norm, more and more people are going to understand it's grow green or don't grow. And, you know, that's a huge transformation in thought for most people, you know, in most economies, and particularly in our economy. Like, do you remember when Prime Minister Harper congratulated Prime Minister Abbott of Australia for abolishing his carbon tax and went, well, no country's going to take measures against carbon that hurt their economy? Well, tell that to the shareholders in Peabody Energy or Arch Coal, because they've certainly seen measures that affect them.
Great. I see a couple more questions. We're coming up against time, so let's do this. Let's take 3 questions at once. Just be very brief. I'll help you, Jeff, as an aide de memoire if you need that. Go ahead.
Then I won't comment on authoritarianism and our current federal government. But Jeff, I might have missed something right at the outset, but could you say anything, or in your book, is there anything about First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, and the ever more effective assertion or recognition of Indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights, or Aboriginal title, and the implications for attitudinal, behavioral, or systems change?
Great. So first question on the Aboriginal dimension. Let's hear the second.
You're remembering these, right?
I'm remembering.
Okay.
Hi. You've spoken tonight a lot about economic sustainability, but I'm a little bit concerned about that the concept of environmental sustainability isn't included. And like this issue of switching from oil sands to agriculture doesn't really address the fact that the agricultural sector in itself is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. So the question is, isn't it time that we look at the economy as a subset of the environment instead of the other way around?
Okay.
Great. And let's hear our final question tonight.
I was wondering if you could comment on the impact of higher temperatures on agriculture in Ontario. Will we be losing more than we're gaining? Because I believe Ontario agriculture is much more value-added per acre than out west.
Right, because we grow different crops, because we have longer growing seasons. Okay, let me take the last one. I talked about the prairies because it's obviously the largest area of arable land and has always been our food basket. But you know, there's other areas, and one of them is the clay belt in northern Ontario, in the area around New Liskeard and Kapuskasing. It's the old lake bed of a pre-glacial lake called Lake Ojibwa. And it's as fertile as anything in the prairies, even more so. Of course, it has like a 2-week growing season. Okay? You turn the thermostat up 4 degrees and you can grow corn there, okay? And believe me, that's going to change the value of farmland in New Liskeard. I mean, what happened was, you know, people were sold a bill of goods by the provincial government who said there was a breadbasket, and farming failed there, and it became a resource area based on mining and forestry. Well, you might see agriculture come back there. And there are, by the way, archipelagos of these clay belts scattered all through the Canadian Shield, in Quebec and in Labrador. So we may see agriculture spring up in places that we never thought we were going to see agriculture spring up.
The second to last question was just about the carbon intensity of farming. A lot of the inputs of farming, nitrogen fertilizer, you know, these are extracted from
That's right.
petrochemicals. So to what extent are we?
It's not a carbon neutral activity, but nowhere does it have anything close to the carbon intensity of bitumen extraction and processing. You know, the issue with agriculture, the ecological issue, is going to be water, because, you know, the same climate changes that are turning the thermostat up are melting the Columbia ice fields, and hence the spring runoff. And you might say, well, Canada's got 20% of the fresh water supply, but it goes in the wrong place. Interbasin water transfers is probably going to be the biggest environmental issue in the next 20, 30 years. And I don't mean shipping it to the States. I mean redirecting water from, say, the Peace or the Athabasca down to the South Saskatchewan. Because when you do things upstream, it has consequences downstream. Like, for example, when the Colorado River empties into the Sea of Cortez, it has the discharge equivalent of the Don River. So, you can suck things dry, is what I'm saying. But if you look at the Imperial Valley, if you get like a lettuce in New York or Toronto in January, chances it's in the Imperial Valley. The Imperial Valley is the Sonoran Desert that gets less than 3 centimeters of rainfall a year. But if you divert millions of acre feet from the Colorado River, all of a sudden that worthless desert scrubland becomes the most expensive agricultural land in the United States. So water is going to be key here. And, diverting water is not without its environmental consequences. And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the big environmental issues, I think, is going to be not about moving oil. It's going to be about moving water.
Final question was the Aboriginal dimension to all this.
Yeah, I talk a little bit about that in terms of hydropower and Quebec. The James Bay development flooded an area the size of New York State. But most people would go, well, nobody lives up there, right? Well, guess what? Folk do live up there. And folks' traditional lives were decimated. Mercury levels in the fish went up about 7 to 8 times. There were settlements, but in the days when the James Bay power development was, there was no regulatory recourse or anything. You can't do that anymore, okay? And if we're going to develop hydro, we're not going to be flooding thousands and thousands of square hectares of woodland to do that. They're going to have to be run-of-the-river technologies where we're not creating big impoundments. We're basically using the river's natural flow, and I think that that's probably where future hydro development will be. But that's been where Aboriginal communities have been the most impacted, in places like Manitoba and Quebec, where there's just been these huge impoundments that create these huge reservoirs that just drown, basically, the forest.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 8 o'clock. There's an opportunity for a book signing by Jeff. And I think just on behalf of all of us, let's thank our author and our presenters tonight.
Thank you very much, Greg.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.